Great. Hello again, everyone. Thanks again for joining us today. I'm Joyce Pan on the marketing team here at Datavant, and I'll be serving as your moderator for the discussion. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce our speakers, Jason Reith and Mark Unger. Jason Reith is Chief Strategy Officer at Kythera, where he looks after strategy, marketing, and partnerships. Jason has over 25 years of experience in digital healthcare and healthcare information, and has been an entrepreneur and intrapreneur helping to grow industry-leading companies. And we're happy to have his curiosity, energy, and ideas with us today. And Mark Unger is our head of product management and leads Datavant's product team, where he strives to deliver best-in-class products that enable clients to de-identify, discover, and connect healthcare data sets. Prior to Datavant, he designed and launched enterprise data products that provided insights on the performance of millions of mobile apps. Before I transition the conversation to Jason, please note that our presenters welcome questions throughout the conversation, and please submit any and all questions to the Q&A function here.
Hey, thanks, Joyce. It's Jason Reith here from Kythera. Mark and I are very happy to have everybody join us today. And I think both Mark and I have a little less hair than we did in our profile pictures. So hopefully this will recognize us. So we're here to have a casual conversation today and make this really engaging about how to use patient level information, direct individual human beings that can be followed and engaged for the benefit of patients and for the benefit of your business. We're going to talk through a couple real world examples and hopefully give you guys some best practices and outline patient benefits. But before we do that, I'd just like to make sure that everybody understands our perspective. Our perspective is that we are acting in the patient's best interest. We find that absolutely essential. I know both our organizations and personally, Mark and I hold this in very high regard. It's okay to have a shared objective to be both successful in business and to forward patients as consumers in their clinical and commercial outcomes. So we're going to talk about a lot of stuff today. It's for educational, sort of innovative and idea purposes. Please apply your own discretion to what you choose to move forward with. This is certainly not an endorsement of what's right for you. And we also recognize that dealing with patient data can be sensitive. Either in an aggregate or specifically at a more known individual level. So please engage expertise here, get legal counsel, get privacy counsel. Shout out to our privacy partner, Mirador Analytics. They do a great job on that. But please ask an expert, whether it's a lawyer or a third party, to help you out with that. And Mark and I are also both really well connected to our product teams and drive a lot of product at our companies. And the things we're going to talk about today may be a little forward-looking, so they may or may not be on our roadmap, but we hope to stimulate some pretty good conversation today for everybody. So please do ask questions as we go along. We'll do our best to answer them as they're relevant to the content, and or hold them to the end and get to everybody then. So with that said, Mark, thanks for joining us, and let's talk through some tokenization.
Perfect. Thank you, Jason. And thanks everybody for being here. Plus one to what Jason and Joyce said. If you have questions as I go through the next couple slides here on tokenization, please send them into the Q&A function. We're hoping that this is a half hour, 40 minutes here. That's more of a discussion. So also Jason may jump in as I'm presenting, and we'll have a discussion back and forth and vice versa as Jason's walking through it. So please do fire up that Q&A function. Okay, so we want to kind of set the table here by saying, what is tokenization as sort of a foundational technology that allows us to connect patient data, understand what a patient's conditions are, and be able to engage with that patient. So to do that, we'll kind of start with the basics here. For some of you may be familiar, may have worked with tokenization before. What tokenization does at its core is it's replacing patient identifiers with de-identified tokens. And de-identified here is HIPAA de-identified. So these have been assessed for their cryptographic security. And so you basically end up with a record that no longer has direct identifiers like the patient's name or zip code or email or social security number. And instead you have derivatives of those things that we call tokens. Okay. Typically for one patient record, you'll end up creating multiple different tokens that are different unique combinations of that patient individual data. So we talk about a patient token, but in practice, there's typically multiple tokens that are created for each record. And the importance of being able to create multiple tokens per record is that you're able to have flexibility in terms of how you actually deploy those tokens across patient data sets. And so that both means you can tokenize a wide range of records. And so that might be both first-party data that you or your organization holds, maybe third-party data that you want to connect to, maybe consumer data, maybe device data. By having the flexibility to tokenize different types of data sets, you're able to get a very wide range of data of patients that can be tokenized, and thus a wider range of patients that can be analyzed and have their data connected. Tokens can also be used to link data across organizations. And so as long as you have a consistent tokenization, and it's sort of a core of what Datavant's providing is neutral infrastructure and connectivity across organizations, you can work with another partner, and you know that your tokenization can then be used to connect records with that organization. And then, of course, the million-dollar question often, okay, so tokenization is used to match records. How accurate can that match be? How certain can we be that when we match records, those matches are accurate? And then on the flip side, how certain can we be that if there are multiple records for the same human being across data sets or within data sets, how accurate is tokenization at making sure that we find all of those matches? And what we've seen in a number of studies that we've run is that when you have full patient information, you can do very, very well with tokenization. We've seen results in real world data sets above 99.5% on both precision, which is the accuracy of the match, as well as what we call recall, which is how much of the matches in the data set can you find. So that's sort of the basics here. Tokenize a patient record, create multiple tokens, and you get this connectivity and flexibility to be able to get high match rates. All right, so we'll take a look at one record here to kind of make this non-abstract. So in this case, we have a patient. We might have data on this patient related to their prescription history. We have Noah Sullivan. We have some basic information on them. And potentially we know that they signed up for a program that is available to individuals suffering from cardiovascular disease, as an example. We tokenize that record. So on the right-hand side here, you can now see that we've created multiple tokens from that patient's individual information. And those tokens then allow us through other data sets that have been similarly tokenized to bring in additional information, and we're filling out the picture of this patient's overall journey and history. So not only do we know that they have cardiovascular disease, we can find additional historical diagnoses going back years. We can find providers who have treated this patient. We can find the list of medications that this patient has had, potentially also understanding adherence to those medications. We can connect in lab data. And so we're really able to, through tokenization, complete the picture for this patient. Okay, now one of the, as we said, challenges of this is how do you do accurate matching? It's also the opportunity here to be able to match records accurately. So this is an example here where we have a patient, Stephen Lane. We might have one record where Stephen was input incorrectly. In this case, let's say with a V, whereas the official name is a PH. We may also have this person moving around, and potentially the address recorded on the record changes over time. And so what you're able to do through tokenization and through some of Datavant's matching technologies to be able to resolve those identities back to one individual and end up with a single identifier for this person, and then be able to accurately connect records across these different sources. In this case, we're imagining prescription claims, medical device data, and EHR data need to come together to fill out the picture. Okay, and so now to kind of zoom out, that's one patient, one example, in blue here, we're connecting that patient's data, but what we're really able to do is to do this at scale. So the same technology that allows you to tokenize records, create multiple tokens, and derive matches can then be used at scale across really any data sets. So the key thing is that this isn't specific to claims data or EHR data. It's not specific to Stephen Lane or a PH and a V problem, right? It's really general. And so we see this being done to date. We've seen hundreds of billions of records tokenized, and we've seen high match rates achieved across a wide range of data sets, from high quality clinical data and even through to consumer data sets. So that's kind of drawing back. This really works across data sets and across patients.
Hey, Mark, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
If I can raise my hand and interject.
Yes, please do.
As much as we talked about this, I think one of the things that we hear a lot, or the question that kind of comes up, is around nomenclature about this, right? And what I mean by that is some people call it tokenization, some people call it identity resolution, or even cohorting, or grouping. How do you, what's your perspective on what to call this, or how those concepts interact, if you think they're different?
Yeah, so I think we generally see those at tokenization as a means by which you can resolve identities. And so we don't see it as an either or. We see that tokenization enables the connectivity of patient data with high accuracy. And as a result, you're able to resolve the identity for a particular record. And then you're able to do that across a data set. And then you're able to do that across organizations. So it ultimately gives you the power of identity resolution. And by creating multiple tokens, back to the benefit of this, you can also have flexibility in dialing up and down the match rates. So we have seen in practice, sometimes your desired match rate may be very sensitive to the precision of the match, which is to say you want to be very sure that if a match is declared by the system, that that match is accurate. And in that case, you may be willing to sacrifice some recall, as we call it, and you're willing to say, I want to have an extremely high match, even if I miss 10% more matches. And in other cases, in some of the cases we might talk about today, it might be the flip, and maybe 99% match rate precision is acceptable, and you want a wider number of matches to be able to have a broader patient segment from which to operate on and find providers or whatever the use case may be. So that's kind of how we think it allows you to resolve identity through tokenization, and you get that flexibility of how you actually deploy it. So how do you all think about it? Is there anything you'd add to that, Jason?
No, I think we just see it as you described, it's sort of use case based, right? People say whatever they're going to say based on sort of what they know or what they've interacted with in the past, but the goal is always the same, to match a bunch of records to individuals and move them forward.
Great. Okay. And actually, we have an audience question, so I will jump in. Thank you to the audience members who submitted this. Is there any difference between tokenization approaches? So what I would say is certainly different tokenization approaches may use different elements of patient information. The sort of fundamental approach, though, is typically similar, which is you're replacing identified information with a de-identified marker or set of markers, and those can then be used to resolve the identity. But as you're thinking about a tokenization vendor, asking what tokens do you have? How does the process work? What feeds into these de-identified markers? Do you have any evidence that these work well in certain situations or others? Those are the types of questions you would want to ask. But sort of foundationally, typically a similar approach, with the details may differ across vendors. So thank you to the audience member for submitting that.
Yeah, there's another question that's coming up too from the audience, and it's about how your tokenization approach differs or is the same as blockchain, right? I guess we hear that a lot too, right? Like, how you get that sort of distributed ledger versus tokenization.
Yeah, so I think this is to some extent maybe a typical sort of misunderstanding about blockchain versus tokenization. So let me kind of address this by saying the core hashing used in tokenization, at least for Datavant, I'll speak on behalf of Datavant, the core hashing function, SHA-256 that's used, turns out to be the same hashing function that is used in most blockchain use cases, and most famously Bitcoin. But those are different applications of hashing. So I would say that tokenization is really not related to blockchain directly, even though the core cryptographic function, that hash function, is the same. And both of those functions have, or that function has the nice property of being able to destroy the connection between the input data and the output data with cryptographic certainty. And that's why both of those applications use it, but they're really different applications and different purposes under the hood.
So I can't use Datavant to buy a latte in El Salvador?
You cannot. We do not recommend that. No, we do think the tokens are very valuable, though, but in a different context. Okay, thanks again for that question. So a couple best practices. As you're thinking about data sets, patient data that you hold or patient data that you may be working with, what are the best practices here around deploying this technology? So one is a simple one, which is more input data on the patients typically leads to better results. Okay, so the wider range of data that you have, you'll be able to get more flexible, higher quality matches. You'll also be able to match with a wider range of other data holders if you create more and more types of tokens. So more input data equals better results. Creating a diverse set of tokens, so sort of a derivative of this. If you are working with a consumer data set and they have information related to, say, the email or phone number of a consumer that's using their service, say it's a support group for folks with a certain condition, If your data set is able to tokenize those elements, then you can connect to those data sets more easily and more directly. Now, if you don't have those same elements, there are options, and sort of outside of this forum here, we'd be happy to talk through that. But the sort of direct connection and high quality match happens when you're able to create the same set of tokens. So we recommend creating a diverse set and not just one particular token. I touched on this before. You can tune your precision and tune your recall as you deploy tokenization to actually resolve identities and match records. So you have some flexibility there, which we definitely see across different use cases as valuable. And then the other thing is you should think through as you deploy tokenization, what sort of controls do you want in terms of what this data can be linked to? And one of the nice parts of tokenization is that there is encryption that allows data sets to be intentionally non-linked. Of course, typically you're tokenizing so that you can connect data sets, but for your use cases, you may want to have two data sets that are not linkable or that are separate, or you may be working with a partner and sending data out and say, hey, I only want these types of linkages. So best practice here is think that through. Think through what do you want to be connected with, what don't you want it to be connected with, and then there's a way to implement that with technical controls, as well as, of course, any contractual or data use agreements related to how your tokens would be used. Okay, so now we'll turn to the real world in the industry here. So tokenization has gotten deployed across pretty much every organization here. Now there's a wide range of different types of data, and I will turn this actually, Jason, over to you as a practitioner who's working with these wide range of data sets. Maybe talk through a little bit about what these data sets are and how do you and how does Kythera bring these data sets together?
Yeah, so for anybody that doesn't know either Kythera or Datavant does a really good job of resolving patient identities, right? So they bring patient parts together. And at Kythera, we bring transaction parts together. So we bring all these different data assets together. And even though we have things like medical claims, prescription claims, EHR data, consumer data in-house, it's really nice to be able to go out to like your ecosystem, Mark, to be frank, and find some lab partners or some imaging partners, wearables, social determinants data, that kind of stuff. And genomics lately has been really big with us. So we're finding that patient data is fragmented. That's hopefully going to be an old adage sooner than later. But we're bringing it across and finding that people are bringing their own data now. We call it BYOD, bring your own data, to this. And it's interesting because of all the things we can do, like on our side as a platform, and we can bring together doctors and diagnoses and things like that, standardize and make that data better quality, better match. But having the patient part separate is really important for privacy, right? Because you don't really want to sort of touch that PHI or that PII up front. So to be able to bring in sort of a non-radioactive data set from an ecosystem is really valuable to our customers separately, right? So be able to put on the side.
Jason, you mentioned bringing together and sort of resolving transactions. I think that's interesting because we think a lot about tokenization and identity and how do you make sure that the records are brought together consistently. Do you see issues with consistency around the standardization of the data and the record itself of different claims data or different lab data or different EHR data? How do you resolve coding and taxonomy so that you can get an accurate picture that if you say this patient has had these conditions in the past, that's true and that you're not missing something or miscategorizing? So on the data side, not the identity side, how do you see that sort of interoperability across these different sources? Is that a problem?
Yeah, it's absolutely a problem, huge use case. And probably because we're based in Nashville, we kind of think about it as music, right? Like it's like if you have an old Beatles recording and every song or every instrument's on its own track, that needs to be pulled together, right, and remastered. And when you sort of want to present that song, right, you have to go back and remaster each individual instrument before you combine them, right? And that's kind of what we wind up doing. Is we wind up remastering that data at a transaction level, combining it in a unique way. That's a whole other webinar, Mark, but great question.
Got it. All right, then back to our current webinar. Sorry.
Yeah, I think it's a huge problem though. And one of the things that we're running into now is we see a lot of people bringing their own data, like I was saying, and wanting to use it sort of at the patient level, right? Sort of the heart of what we want to talk about today. And so probably the biggest thing that we get asked about when it comes to how do I use like patient level data, right? What does that even mean? Like if I'm using patient level data, aren't I identifying somebody's grandmother, and isn't that a HIPAA violation? You know, well, I'm not going to get into being a HIPAA expert, which I'm certainly not. I can tell you that we put it in kind of two categories, right? Identifying a person versus knowing an individual, right? And so the way we look at it is identifying and knowing are similar on a lot of axes, right? They both use patient level transactional data or demographic data. We understand the behaviors and sort of the, you know, who you work for, what doctor you see, how old you are, kind of stuff. And that can be safely used. The difference gets down into, and this is where, you know, like solution like Datavant comes in, is we don't want the PHI, that you know, personal health information or that personally identifiable data. We don't want it visible. We want to be able to know the person. I want to be able to know that Mark, you know, Mark exists in the data, and follow Mark as an individual, an anonymous individual, and be able to act, you know, individually to customize your experience while still not actually being able to point you out on the street, right? So to be able to remove your contact information, phone numbers, addresses, your numerical data, you know, your cardholder ID, your social security number in a lot of cases comes through on healthcare data. So to be able to remove that and to put it into some sort of tokenized, de-identified package makes it super convenient to use, and still enables people to follow an individual and, you know, apply some of the examples we'll talk about at an individual level without having to worry about re-identification. So re-identification risk is the big risk that we talk about.
And Jason, we actually just got a question related to re-identification risk. Is it okay if I jump in with that? So the question was, how is the statistical certification process, also known as the expert determination process, how is that evolving as more data is combined? Does that make re-identification more likely?
So I can tell you, I think we use the same partner actually, Mark. We use Mirador Analytics. We both have integrations into our platforms to do that. You know, all our data before we're delivering it is going to be expertly determined, right? There's this sort of byline in HIPAA that says there are several methods that you can use to say your data is at a low enough risk of re-identification to make it usable. Expert determination is one of those methods, and you know, there's several partners out there. Like I said, well, shameless shout out to Mirador, but they do a really good job of evaluating that. And you know, we run into situations pretty frequently because we use a lot of claims data, right, and a lot of transactional data, and then we layer on top of that things like consumer household data, where you work, where you went to school, household income, things like that, and that can really start to multiply the risk very quickly. So before we add any data, before we distribute any data set, we want to make sure that it's adequately, expertly determined to an acceptable level of risk. You're never going to completely eliminate it because, you know, if somebody's really malfeasant, there's a bad actor out of there. If somebody really wants to hunt somebody down and wants to go that extra mile, you know, you're not going to stop somebody who is motivated and talented in data science. But for the most part, even if you're good at data science and have access to the data, it's pretty tough to go find a person.
Got it. Hey, maybe Jason, I'll just add my 2 cents on that. That totally aligns with what we see. The aspect of how it's evolving, we're seeing as more data is coming together, we will often see additional redactions needed on top. So I don't know if that's something that you all see, but to your point around, once you layer something else on, sometimes there'll be a change to the core data set that's required. That's like, okay, well, before these 2 data sets become linked and live together in a way that the data sets can be joined, you're going to need to change the granularity by which you can understand the patient's location. And often zip3 is a standard element that might need to be redacted to a zip2 or potentially dropped, or maybe at the state level. So we have seen some real examples in certification where additional redactions. So to the audience member's question, how is it evolving? We're seeing more and more redactions, which means you may end up with different certifications in different environments for different combinations of data. That is one potential, depending on the data elements, of course, and the risk as statistically assessed by the expert. But yeah, thanks for the question.
And so the output of that, you know, just kind of put a bow on this is, you know, in the identifying column, which we don't ever want to do, we wind up with somebody like Stephen Lane, right? There's the name, but in the knowing, we can just follow the anonymized patient. who is known or able to be followed anonymously but independently as some, crazy looking token. Okay, so hey, there's another question in the Q&A, Mark. It looks like you might want to grab onto it about PII inputs.
Yeah, so there's a question here about, have we found any applications for some of the Datavant tokens? So this is somebody who's worked with Datavant's tokenization technology. Have we found applications for some of the tokens that employ looser PII inputs, for example, gender, date of birth, and zip5? So that's less granular. I would say that typically that particular combination, gender, date of birth, and zip5, is not used in linkage. We have found use cases for looser elements, particularly when two organizations don't share other elements, except, for example, a name and an email address, right? And you can say name and email address is good, but it's not going to be perfect. Sometimes there will be mismatches there. So I would say when there aren't the same core elements, the looser elements are useful. Also useful when you're trying to get a wider range of matching, which may often happen when you're trying to engage patients or identify providers who may be treating your patients. So those looser PII elements that are used in tokenization can be useful in widening the number of matches, which I think may be a good transition, Jason, to you and to the actual real world applications here for how this gets deployed.
Yeah, I have more questions about that, about your PII, so we can talk about that offline. Yeah, so there's a question coming through about precision medicine and being able to identify and re-identify patients. And so we're going to talk about a couple of use cases today that I hope will address your question, Serena. Ask again if it doesn't sort of start to answer your question. We're going to move through 3 use cases, and we're just going to spend a couple minutes on each one, talk high level, and I'll give you 1 or 2 takeaways, things to look for from each use case. If you want to continue the conversation, Mark and I both really encourage and appreciate engaging with folks after this. So we'll give you our contact info at the end. So our first use case of the 3 here is patient engagement. So by patient engagement, this could mean, a direct to consumer. I like to call patients consumers these days because they are always getting more informed every day. Patient engagement could mean direct to consumer outreach. It could mean advertising, right? It could mean social media interaction, a lot of things. So in typical world today, this is sort of the as is version of the world. You're going to maybe take some aggregated prescription data about, people who are getting your branded prescription or not getting your branded prescription or getting a competitor. Overlay some demographics with that, right? And you're going to build cohorts out of it. So in this example, right, we have 3 sort of cohorts: the sort of extend therapy cohort, the recruit to new therapy cohort, and then a cohort of people you're going to exclude. Takeaway number 1: always manage to exclude the people that you don't want to go after. It's pretty easy to put everybody in a bucket and go after them, but that's not always the best. So then you're going to go and do that engagement thing, right? You're going to go do the extend engagement campaign. You're going to go do the recruit engagement campaign, and then you're going to get a result, right? And typically today that result looks something like, in this market, in North Carolina, Raleigh, North Carolina, I saw market share increase by 0.2% after we ran 3 simultaneous campaigns. Well, what changed your market share, right? It's great that you're able to see a positive uplift. Marketers everywhere, have had trouble monitoring and measuring their success, improving that ROI. So anytime you can measure that, it's great. And then, but you wind up using that sort of same aggregated data, the same aggregated demographics of geography or general patient populations, and you analyze those results by your cohort. So then when you have to go back and if, as a good marketer, you want to adjust those campaigns and try and experiment again, right? Another experiment with updated data. But the problem is you're still operating at group level, right? So by moving that down to a patient level, you go from the cohort version of the world to the individual version of the world, and you get something that looks a little like this, right? So when you start at the beginning again, there's just a couple subtle details here. But when you start with a tokenized or knowable, anonymized person, individual, you can follow that individual at a very specific level. So instead of just using basic demographics now, you can actually build longitudinal behavioral views. Does that person tend to pay for medications? Does that person tend to, drop off after X amount of months? well, how's that person behave? And then you can actually go and not just monitor that individual for the particular success or failure on that campaign, and then understand how that campaign can be made better. But then you can also customize as you change that experiment, because you're operating at an individual level. You can customize that intervention. You can customize that offer at a very specific person level. And again, you don't need to know them, right? But you just need to know that they're a real, unique snowflake and a real human being on the other end, and make a really relevant, specific targeted offer that hope will make their life better, improving their commercial or clinical outcomes, because you're so targeted with their behaviors.
Jason, can I ask, to what extent do you think about doing this deterministically versus a modeling or probabilistic based approach? And deterministic meaning you know this patient, you connect their data, and so therefore you've seen evidence of certain diagnoses, medications, and things like that, versus a modeling approach where you say, based on some history, I'm going to infer that it's likely something else is true about them. Do you see both of those, or how do you think about those different approaches?
Yeah, seeing this sort of evolve, right? You see it start at the cohort. So we're using a probabilistic approach at a group level, and then you start using a probabilistic approach at a person level. But our day job, my day job, is to help people understand how to use that modeled approach, right? That deterministic approach to say, everybody behaves differently, and certain behaviors trigger certain interventions, trigger certain events. And if you know what your goal is, and you know what intervention or event can trigger someone or flip somebody to go more toward that goal, using a deterministic match is much better, right? And it can be really heavy data science, to be honest. Like, that's the trick here, is how much data science are you willing to invest in? How much machine learning are you willing to put up? And that's growing for sure. We see that every day become better and better and better at it. There's a lot of great companies up there doing next best action and decision support analytics right now at this level. It sort of started more at a physician level, to be honest, but it's moving on onto the patient level now, because again, people are bringing their own data that is really specific patient level information. And because you can anonymize it, kind of, run it all through a machine now, it's actually sort of a counterintuitive approach. But because you have better patient level data, because you have more private ways and secure ways to process that data, because you have better data science, you can actually put that all in a black box now and sort of let it run and tune it, and get better results, because you're using machine learning and data science to actually tune the results at an individual level based on historical behaviors.
Got it. And Jason, that kind of walks into a question that we just got, which is, if this process ends up engaging with the patient in some way, how do you do that without re-identifying that individual or having any data associated back to that individual? How do you ensure that the end-to-end thing remains de-identified if there is a patient or a segment of patients that ultimately have some form of engagement?
Well, I mean, your tokens help a lot. Being able to follow, an anonymized string as opposed to an individual, and making sure that you have a marketing machine or a sales operations machine that runs, and departmentalize it. Right. This is marketing automation. This is sales automation at its best. I would say that flowing in nicely into our next example actually is a way that maybe you don't always necessarily want to keep somebody a complete secret, though, right? And I think this is a good use case for moving tokens around and maintaining control of those tokens. So the thing I'd like folks to take away from this is, if you're using a patient hub, right? So what's a patient hub? Patient hub is basically customer service center that's set up by a biopharma manufacturer to help folks resolve their issues, right? Help them get medications paid for, help them find patient assistance programs, help connect them and get them down the road and on therapy, or keep them on therapy. So these patient hubs work in a bunch of different ways, right? They can have patients sort of call in and say, hey, I'm on this plan. Can you help me understand if it's going to be covered? They can understand formulary information, and do that at a, again, pseudo anonymized level, where saying, I know who the payer is, I know who the drug is, but I don't need to know who the patient is. Or they could do it at a very specific level, and they could literally be getting prior authorization sent to them from specialty providers, specialty pharmacies. and be transferring all this information around. So even though you wouldn't think that like getting on a patient assistance program would be much more difficult than registering online or calling up the customer service person at the patient hub, there's a ton of data that gets moved around. Transactional claims data about that person, about the patient's history, consumer or social determinant data that gets moved around about that patient. You know, the providers talking about doing a prior authorization, the pharmacies having problems getting the data, getting the prescription filled, the payers intervening to try and figure out why, right, and what the best pathway is. So the trick to think about here is that when you're doing this sort of patient hub or assistance model, there's the potential, very complex potential, to move data around a lot, and a lot of data a lot of times, or the same data a lot of times. So being able to control that token or change the token so that it's specific to the user and not, you know, and so, you know, I may be token 1, 2, 3, 4 at the patient hub, but I'm token, you know, 5, 6, 7, 8 at the payer. So even though you keep tracking me, even though I can't be sort of re-identified and linked if something breaks down. That's super important here. And, you know, additionally, right, this allows sort of that synthesis from that previous use case where you can say, you know what, from the transactional data, I see that, you know, you have a problem staying on drugs for more than, or staying on medication for more than 3 months. So maybe I can adjust my program, right? Maybe I can change my patient assistance program to keep you going past the hump I know you're going to hit with compliance or adherence. Or conversely, maybe I know that, you know, you don't like to start therapies as a patient because I've watched, you know, I've modeled your behavior, but I know that once you do start them, you stay on them for a long time. So maybe I model that to get you, you know, on therapy, help you start up therapy until you feel better and recognize it's doing wonders for you, and then being able to continue on your own. So the thing, you know, the takeaway from this slide is to be able to understand that data goes a lot of places, even when you don't necessarily think it's that complicated, right? You think a simple customer service call turns into a simple customer service call, but it's not. A lot of data is being exchanged, all for patient benefit, right? But it's complex. And sometimes that's able to be re-identified and linked, and sometimes it's not. But you know, always valuable.
Cool. The only thing I would mention is when we've seen, if there is use cases for re-identification, then that needs to be pretty explicit in the workflow up front, and you need to make sure that you're not going against any of the data use agreements or HIPAA agreements or expert determinations that have been set out. So I think that's clear, but I just want to mention that those sort of controls need to be in place, and in certain cases, re-identification is not possible, can be restricted, and that's that we see that as well.
Yeah, BAAs and notice of privacy practices and all that other stuff are for real. They're acronyms with impact. But you can still intervene at an individual level by either, you know, by being able to share between any of these points, between any of these stakeholders, most importantly the patient, what the real problem is, what the real obstacle is, right? I mean, we've seen pharma companies change patient assistance programs with massive ROI results where they just do things like they recognize, you know, one example, they reduced their patient assistance program they increased their patient assistance program from 5 months to 7 months because they recognized that patients were sort of slipping there. So they gave an extra couple of months because it kept patients on therapy. And, you know, patients benefited from a couple extra months of financial support and, you know, an extra few months of adherence that made them feel better. So there are real interventions here that can be done, again, without having to identify somebody, but to be able to know their use case and build a better, bigger, stronger profile based on their behavior.
Great.
So the last one I'll mention, this is kind of this is the half use case, but it extends from this in that you look at rebating, right? So it's hard to tell exactly, but estimates are plus or minus 50 billion, capital B, dollars are paid out in rebates from pharmaceutical manufacturers to payers in order to, you know, create access to products. And so when you're paying that out, it's a big dollar amount, right? Deserves some auditing, deserves some traction, deserves some understanding of why. And again, if you go back to the first example where they're grouping people in cohorts and you're just seeing that Blue Cross Blue Shield open access PPO is is having a certain rate of interventions where rebates are being paid out. That's fine, right? It's measurable, but it'd be a lot better and a lot more affordable and could save millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe, I don't know, billions potentially, if you're able to audit at an individual level, right? To be able to say this rebate was paid out appropriately or not appropriately, or maybe we missed one, maybe we should have paid a rebate out. So because of the large amount of dollars involved here, you can't measure precisely enough. And being able to apply known individuals at a patient level to that sort of auditing and tracking process for this $50 billion segment of the industry really can help move the needle. We've seen 1 to 4% savings on programs. I mean, I've seen 9-figure savings from some manufacturers, with good, deep, longitudinal rebate auditing and tracking here. So something to consider. Deep concept, important, complex concept, but just something to consider. Great. So we'll leave you just with a couple of thoughts here, and we'll kind of cruise through them just to crystallize what we've talked about. But there's a couple of best practices that we want to make sure people walk away with at high level. And again, happy to talk more in detail. It's a huge topic. Mark and I hope our phone rings off the hook and we get tons of emails about this. But you want to protect your patients. Positively. Choose a trustworthy partner, people that have been doing it for a while. Enlist expertise. Go find partners that have done it before. Go find experts who know what they're doing and have the Palmaris, the referenceable customers. Tokenize. Try not to move around PHI or PII. And you got to make sure you comply with HIPAA and now with state regulation around privacy practices as well. I think it's what California, Virginia, Colorado, they've all implemented state regulation. Just got to protect your patients by protecting your data. Cohorts are great. We always recommend applying some data science at the patient level to build the best ones. The sort of anonymous or the big aggregated demographic driven groups are fine. You're going to do a lot better if you can move up the sophistication ladder a little bit. And we, happy to help with that. The other thing is people do tend to get carried away at first. You start doing some data science, you start building some cohorts and having good results. Start small, start with a handful. And by a handful, I mean 2, 3, 5, 6, maybe, move up to a dozen, and then you can go from there. Eventually, like we just went through an exercise, we had a couple hundred automated cohorts of different populations that were being sent through marketing or engagement automation. So you can get super complicated, but start small, figure it out. You'll make good progress even if you start small. The other thing, this is more of the marketer and me talking, but make sure you're connecting the messaging to offers. We talked about being able to precisely at a precision level, whether it's clinical or commercial, measure behaviors, outcomes at a patient level. So make sure the offer, whether it's a clinical suggestion or commercial financial intervention, make sure it meets, right? Don't just be like, hey, we can help, right? Say something specific, try that on for size. And then experiment, right? When you're gonna, we failed a million times, you're gonna fail a million times, experiment, rinse and repeat, and it'll get very, very much better a lot faster. A/B testing of messaging and offers works really, really well. And then last but not least, we talked about it a little in the beginning. Remember to remove people. If you've already won, the old phrase is like once they've said yes, stop selling, right? Kind of the same thing here. Remember to remove people who either don't want to participate or have participated to the end. Maintain your list. So out of that, you're going to really find, I think, 4 benefits at the end of the day for both patients and for your organization, right? Like I said at the beginning, this does not have to be mutually exclusive. You can have aligned incentives to both grow your healthcare business and also treat patients really, really well and improve their outcomes. Individual offerings definitely increase value to patients, right? Nobody wants a generic thing that isn't going to really impact them. The closer you can get to solving their direct problem, the happier they're going to be, the more loyal they're going to be, the better their outcome's going to be. The closed loop of technology actually increases privacy, right? We talked about marketing automation and things like that. the more you can lock that down, the better, right? When you don't have to have an analyst doing it anymore, when you can use something like a patient token, an anonymized patient, to just start cycling through and improving your data science, create machine learning models. Having that closed loop prevents people from looking at the data. You go in, you do a little QA, build a data science, you have a data scientist build a machine learning model, keep improving it, keeps learning from itself. That closed loop sort of self-teaching model is actually better for privacy, even though that may be a little counterintuitive. Also, that same approach, that closed loop technology approach, is automated and scalable, right? So you can do more experiments, you can reach more people, you can expand your reach, and that eventually leads to improving your efficiency, both budgets and cycles. Your cycles run faster and they run less expensive. Your interventions land more effectively, more efficiently. So you're saving money, you're driving ROI, all those things. So big integrated loop of advantages here for pulling all that through. So that said, thanks everybody. We have a couple questions that have come in. Let's see here. We can go through these.
Yeah, I think I could take one of the first ones here, which was, have we applied this, presumably this is tokenization and connectivity, to clinical trial data or omics type data? So I could speak to what we've seen. So the clinical trial data, definitely. We see the tokenization of patients that are enrolled in clinical trials, and then creating a de-identified environment to connect trial data with additional data on the patient as a use case that's certainly growing in interest. And there's a number of reasons you might want to do that, such as surveillance of the patients after the trial, looking for adverse events in the data. So there's a number of reasons we see that. With the omics type data, I would say same sort of use cases as what we've seen, which is figuring out outcomes and what might be influencing behavior or who are super responders. The only caveat there is that you need to make sure that you are doing the HIPAA expert determination, and that those types of data sets, which can be more complex, which can be more identifying, have that review, and that you may need to end up removing some of the data. So the omics data needs careful scrutiny. So that's probably the only flag there. But conceptually, I think we see a similar interest in using that type of data for these applications. So thanks for that question.
Yeah, and I think that kind of connects to a couple of the other questions here about like use in precision medicine as well, right? We've seen some real small oncology and inpatient scenarios. I mean, there's one scenario at 151 patients, right? And tried to build that cohort. So some things you just can't move forward with because it is too small, and you have to have expert determination involved. But certainly the ability to look longitudinally, especially with a great big data set, right? Sort of shop. You can go to the grocery store in the Datavant data ecosystem, and pick up claims data and genomics data and lab data and imaging data, and build that sort of runway of what a patient has done. The tests they've gone through, the outcomes they've achieved, all those sorts of things, even genetic markers. You can get really precise in building clinical models. We've seen it used to build AI clinical models for treatment. So there's a couple of really cool companies out there actually who are really advancing that right now. But happy to share that offline if anybody's interested in who's doing that.
Cool. Hey Jason, one more question. For the use cases you walk through, do organizations need to have their own patient level data to get started if they're trying to identify a cohort of interest for a particular drug? For a particular campaign, do they need to bring data as part of that? Yeah,
data is a commodity these days, to be really honest with you, for the most part. Like that sort of base transactional data. There's really cool non-commoditized proprietary assets up there at the specialty level, at the lab level. But for the most part, like what our customers do, right? Our customers kind of log into a platform, and we have 300 million patients worth of data there, and we have all the dimensions they need to connect to. So we tried to make that sort of an inclusive experience where you can just start from a base. I'm obviously a little biased, but if you ask me, I'm going to say start from that base and be able to add the data that you want into sort of that base of a strong commodity, strongly represented commodity database, because you can then have everything to link to right away. and you can get started understanding the market directionally or from a high level view, and then start to drill down as you learn and as you find individual use cases.
Another question here, Jason. How about engagement with providers? The flip side of patients, is there use cases, or how should the audience here think about provider identification? That is, providers that are treating patients that may be of interest.
Yeah, for a lot of years, like decades even, I would argue, since probably the 70s, people have been going directly to providers. The requirement of expert determination at the provider level is much lower than it is at the patient level. It gets a little dicey sometimes if you're dealing with specialty patients. When one patient may show up at a doctor's office, there may be 1,000 or 2,000 patients in the U.S. that have a diagnosis each year for certain diseases. That's really up to the organization individually on how they want to pursue that. But we've seen people with like an example. There was a super expensive drug that a large pharma manufacturer knew that if they could get to a patient within 9 days of the drug being prescribed, they could successfully create a prior authorization that would get that person on therapy, and they'd go from $80,000 to a few dollars, right, to get that done. The only way to do that, the way they chose to do that, was to look at a patient level data, anonymized patient data, at the provider level. So they would know when that patient showed up at a provider, and they'd go visit the provider. They wouldn't necessarily knock on the door and say, "Hey, I'm here for the 37-year-old female with whatever diagnosis," but they would show up and say, "Hey, can we help with any prior authorizations?" Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And that sort of thing works, right? And again, there's probably some ethical or philosophical debate in there about your mileage may vary, but again, our hearts are patient first, and so we think that there's a great need there that gets filled on the patient side, and a great obstacle that gets removed for therapy.
Great. Okay, we have a question here that maybe I can take. So there was a question around when tokenization is used across organizations, does that require agreeing on the same tokenization? So simple answer, yes. We didn't start with any background on Datavant, but part of what Datavant does as a company is provide tokenization to hundreds of organizations, and all the logos on the slide before are companies that are working with Datavant tokenization, so that agreement on the tokenization is there. Now, of course, there still needs to be willingness to share the data and willingness to link the tokens, and data use agreements and licensing and those sorts of things need to be put in place. To be clear, it's not a free-for-all, but they do need to agree on the tokenization if you want to be able to connect across the organization. So yeah, I want to make sure that's covered. Thanks for that question.
And there's a question here, and I directed at you. I have a perspective on this, Mark, but I'd like to hear your answer first. What's the biggest upcoming advance in your technology that you think is going to impact patient connectivity?
Yeah, so that's a good question and a big question. I guess you can either answer this in the next year and be certain, or you can draw it back and say, okay, over the next 5 years, and you're going to look like a genius or wildly off. Let me answer the sort of like longer term. I think right now, one of the biggest frictions to getting data connected is the ability for that data to actually flow and physically be in the same location. Because for that to happen, a lot of times data holders are willing for their data to be used in certain use cases that benefit patients. And they will say conceptually, yes, I'm fine with my data being used for this type of query, identifying patients that suffer from something, but they may be unwilling or unable due to restrictions in their own data use agreements to actually send that data out. And so one potential type of technology would be something like federated learning, where you could have a network of data holders that are all agreeing to share their data for particular queries or particular use cases without that data needing to actually flow and be transferred across organizations and live in the same place. So that is, in my mind, one potential game-changing thing to improve how much connectivity there can be in what's today a very fragmented world. I'd say it's certainly early days, and we don't see a ton of widespread adoption of that. That's not powering a lot of actual use cases. But if we look at a couple of years, again, with the caveat that the world may shift, that certainly seems to me to be one potential way that connectivity changes in a real fundamental way. Jason, what you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I take it a little bit. I'm looking into the future a little bit, a couple of years where like Google's going to do away with cookies, and you're going to stop being able to track people, online and things like that. It's going to get much tighter. Apple just released iOS 15 that's tightening up privacy controls, right? And so there's going to be a revolution here around privacy and how data is connected, whether it's transactional resolution, individual resolution. But there's got to be something that comes out of that, right? And that's the problem we try to solve every day, is how do we get over that chasm, right? When people are going to start sort of gathering their own data, recognizing that the big chunks of commoditized data are a fine base, but are of decreasing value, and they have these things like their engagement campaigns and things like that. They need to translate into integratable data that doesn't just sort of like use averages of averages to work together, but actually works together in a behavioral longitudinal way. So I think the biggest advance that I'm kind of we're working on is trying to figure out how to jump that chasm where you can really bring just any data set you want, and the blue collar sort of boring work of making all that stuff work together when it's intentionally being designed not to work together in the future is the biggest challenge or advance I see.
Great. Okay, maybe with that, finishing on the big fundamental, what's going to change. Now, maybe with that, we can wrap up. We're just at the end here. So maybe I'll just say thank you to the audience members for being here, and everybody who's made it through with us to the end. We really appreciate your time. If you've asked us a question and we weren't able to answer it, we'll be sure to follow up with you. But thank you, Jason, as well, for being here. And Joyce, maybe you can close us on out.
Great. Thanks everyone for attending, and Mark and Jason, thank you for the insightful discussion. For all registrants and attendees, we will share the recording through an email, so be on the lookout if you would like to watch and review the materials. Thanks again, everyone.